Okay. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Julia Sass-Rubin, and I'm a professor at the Edward J. Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers University, along with my fellow conference organizers and Rutgers colleagues, Bruce Baker, Charles Payne, Drew Gittomer, Sal Rubenstein, and Steve Danley. I would like to welcome you all to the third session of the 2020 Education Reform Communities and Social Justice Research Conference. It's great to see everybody. We kicked off the conference this year on May 20th with a plenary with Diane Ravitch, which I know many of you were at. Last week, we had a session of 4 papers on equity, politics, and race. And that session, minus the discussion and question section, will be online on the conference website, hopefully later today, as well as some of the papers that were presented, any that could be shared. I'm going to put the URL for the conference website in the chat feature in a few minutes, and just in case any of you don't have it handy and would like to be able to access that information. There are 4 sessions after this week. Next week, there'll be a session on equity, politics, and race. And the week of June 24th, we have a plenary on alternatives to high-stakes standardized testing. The agenda for all the sessions is also on the conference website. And then we have 2 more sessions in July. You can use the same login information as you used today for all the remaining sessions. And you should continue to receive reminders, I assume you all did for today, from me the day of and the day before, or some combination of that to remind you to log in. The 3 papers being presented today are on themes related to teachers and school leaders, as well as civic engagement of students. After the papers are presented, there'll be about half an hour for Q&A and discussion. Please use the chat feature, which all of you should be able to find at the bottom of your screens or at the top for some of you, if you want to ask any questions. And you can put down that you have a question at any point. I will just call on you when it's time for questions. You don't have to put the question in. You can just indicate that you have one and which speaker it's for or which paper it's for. And I'll call on you when it's that time. So the first paper being presented today is on teachers as political actors, social justice caucuses, and the fight to transform public education. And the author and the presenter is Chloe Asselin, who recently completed, I hope I didn't torture your last name, Chloe, who recently completed her PhD from the City University of New York Graduate Center. The paper is a chapter in an edited volume called Walkout, Teacher Militancy, Activism, and School Reform that'll be published late this fall. So unfortunately, Chloe couldn't share an early version, but now you can put that down on your to-buy list, and I'll put that in the chat feature as well. So Chloe, take it away.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. So yes, thank you, Julia, for the introduction. I'm Chloe from the Graduate Center, and this is a paper that will be part of a chapter that will be part of a book. And so it's Teachers as Political Actors, Social Justice Caucuses, and the Fight to Transform Public Education. Since the 1990s, cities across the United States have experienced the extensive privatization of public education. Picower and Mayorga described this attack on public education as a hydra, with the multiple heads maintaining white supremacy, economic inequality in schools and cities, and this, which has all been further exposed by the demographic toll of the COVID-19 health crisis and the most recent Black Lives Matter protests against police brutality and for racial justice in US schools and society. So in the face of these assaults on public education, some teachers have turned to a model of social justice unionism, which organizes around bread and butter issues, teaching and learning issues, and social justice in the community and in the curriculum in collaboration with parents, students, and communities. And it's an approach that stands in contrast to a more traditional business service style teacher unionism that focuses much more narrowly on contract bargaining and serving as grievance agents for individual members. So in their endeavors to move their longstanding business service style unions towards social justice unionism, teachers have formed social justice caucuses within their unions. And I focus on 2 of these caucuses, the Movement of Rank and File Educators, which is in New York City, as part of the United Federation of Teachers, and the Caucus of Working Educators in Philadelphia, which is part of the Philadelphia Federation of Teachers. And caucuses in any given union form as a result of a small group of like-minded union members who come together because of dissatisfaction with the actions of union leadership and or with the existing structures and policies within their unions and or workplaces. And while caucuses can form on any basis, social justice caucuses demand that the labor movement look beyond the collective bargaining process and expand the union's mission to include parents, students, and progressive social groups and organizations to engage in social justice caucuses beyond the workplace. As of 2019, there were more than 20 social justice caucuses across the United States in teacher unions, some of whom have won control of their unions, and that number keeps growing. Most of these caucuses exist in states with unionization rates that are above the national average, so about at 10.3%, except Albuquerque, Arizona, Colorado, North Carolina, Virginia, and Wisconsin. And this may reflect the difficulties of labor organizing in states with anti-union laws. So members of social justice caucuses vary greatly in their experiences in schools, their identities and positionalities. But what brings the caucus organizers together are three significant progressive traditions: social justice pedagogy, rank and file labor organizing, and leftist social movements. In addition, most social justice caucuses are majority white organization. They reflect the overwhelmingly white teaching force in the United States. However, the majority of these caucuses create purposeful and mindful spaces for educators of color, including Black educator, racial justice, and immigration justice organizing committees, in addition to training educators of color, especially women of color, to become leaders within the caucuses and their unions. And many of the central organizers from social justice caucuses across the United States are people of color. Social justice caucuses also try to do political education for white educators about racism and white privilege in schools and society, and being an anti-racist. But nonetheless, given the hegemony of racial capitalism and white supremacy in the United States, recruiting and maintaining educators of color remains a struggle for many of these social justice caucuses, as it does for many of the school districts across this country. To understand the various ways in which educators are using social justice caucuses, I engaged in a 4-year qualitative study, which I observed and interviewed 25 social justice caucus members and allies in More and We from 2014 to 2018. And the largest section of this study comes from participant observation and interviews with New York City's More members. Once I began attending monthly We meetings and conducting interviews in Philadelphia, I found many more similarities than differences between the two caucuses. And literature on the Chicago's Caucus of Rank and File Educators, which is an exemplar of social justice unionism, echoed all these similarities that I found. And valuing teachers' feedback about my analysis, I shared my initial findings with 4 participants from More and 2 from We, and asked for feedback, which also informed my overall analysis and conclusions. So progressive educators often join social justice caucus because they're disappointed with the educational reforms and issues of injustice and inequity in their schools and cities, and the perceived apathy of their school districts and union leadership. So, quote, "We have a problem up in my majority Black district where there's a racist superintendent who was recently fired, who was stopping students from registering into a school," explains Aaron. "So where is everybody? Where is my union on that? All I need is one sentence statement that we need equity in our schools, but they did absolutely nothing." So educators see the caucus as a means to fight against racism and other oppressions in schools and society, and for a more just, equal, and transformative educational system in a way that the union and the public school system are often unwilling or unable to do. And while they do feel disillusioned with their teacher unions, these educators who join the social justice caucuses do believe in the power of the labor movement. And so they're pushing for change from within their unions rather than disengaging from it fully. So for example, Moore's website has a statement that says, "A strong member-driven union that stands together with our communities is the only way to have the public schools we all deserve. The time is now to revitalize the teachers union here in New York City." And We makes a very similar comment on their website about its role in strengthening the union. So they're working from within. And so what do activist social educators in these social justice caucuses say? So first, the social justice caucuses believe in democratic unions in which members are active and engaged in order to use the power of the rank and file to fight for just, equal, and fully funded and staffed schools. So Derek states, quote, "Everyone in the caucus agrees on paper that unions are not active enough in schools, and the union is largely disengaged from its membership. And then a large number of schools, there is no active union." So traditional business service style unions focus narrowly on the contract bargaining and serving as grievance agents on behalf of individual members without necessarily ever organizing or mobilizing the members en masse. So on the other hand, teachers and social justice caucuses are committed to these member-driven unions. So Sierra states, quote, "I don't see my union create any kind of space for discussion. If there are spaces, they were created to defend the union's position on something. So I think the caucus is creating the space where we are validating members and saying, what do you think we should do? What can we do?" So second, social justice caucuses believe in an active and fighting union that will lead to public schools and cities that students deserve. So in explaining a campaign at her school where they were boycotting excessive standardized testing, Janelle says, to have, quote, "To have a campaign that goes after more than just our bread and butter, our union leadership, we called them up and they said, don't do it. We do not support you." But to me, that was what our union should be looking for, ways for us to fight and win. We can actually do something if we come together. So Janelle believes winning doesn't only happen at the negotiating table or behind closed doors, which is something that most business service style unions really rely on, but must be mobilized and organized for collectively. So educators in More and We are challenged their unions to activate the collective power of the rank and file, rather than rely on union leaders to simply represent workers in fights against the employer. And finally, social justice caucuses believe in union organizing that changes educational policy by building on the educational justice movement beyond the membership, and that involves parents, students, and community members. So most business service style unions do not actively organize and mobilize with students, parents, and communities, especially not for collective power or broader demands. While social justice caucus activists really push the union to become a social movement based in collective power. So Steve explains, quote, "If you just believe the purpose of the union is to give us a slightly better deal in the current system, then there might not be a reason for the union to engage in social justice. But I think if you have a more revolutionary perspective, you're saying these other issues matter and our existence should be to working class people and to students and parents, etc. And our existence shouldn't only be to benefit our own kind of narrowly defined interests. So the argument is that you have to create a broader movement that's advocating for working class interests." So More and We challenge the assumption that unions can only bargain for their wages, their benefits, and the working conditions, and they connect the fight of teachers for good working conditions to the struggles of all working people for fair treatment, because they see those issues as interconnected. So for example, both caucuses organized around immigration justice. More and its allies played a role in the United Federation of Teachers, their union, in a resolution that was adopted demanding immigration advisors in every school. The resolution was presented to the New York City Department of Education and the then Chancellor Carmen Farina. And we and its allies pushed the District of Philadelphia to host mandatory trainings for teachers called Creating Safe and Welcoming Schools for Immigrant and Refugee Students. So Derek also passionately highlights the work he did in his own school around immigration justice, quote, "We had a forum on Know Your Rights if ICE knocks on your door at your school. And that was organized by the caucus in my school and a bunch of other community groups." Derek adds that the local forums led by caucus members on immigration rights persuaded union leadership to hold their own immigration forum. So he said, "It's a good way to push the union. You move ahead and you do the work the union is supposed to be doing in our schools and you force them to catch up." So this is a good example of being the union you want to be. Caucuses also organized around excessive standardized testing. Sierra explains, quote, "The fact that we've allied with parents during the opt-out movement, that juxtaposed us, that separated us from our union leadership. The fact that we will publicly call out the city and the Department of Education on policies that our union leadership will never do. We cannot go forward when we know that there are policies that can impact our students' lives, our communities, and our working conditions." So Sierra highlights how her social justice caucus aligned itself with parents in opposition to the union leadership and to the Department of Education in an attempt to protect students refusing to take government mandated standardized tests, which is the opt-out movement, which protests the overuse of testing in public schools that is often not aligned with the curriculum that students are learning. In addition, due to their middle-class, white, English-speaking focus, the tests often do not reflect the knowledge of students of color, of English language learners, students with disabilities, and low-income students. So while the teacher unions in New York City and Philadelphia dismissed the opt-out movement when it started, both have now come out against excessive standardized testing. And the movement led by parents and teachers also forced states such as New York and Pennsylvania to reduce the test rules in teacher evaluations and to reduce the length and number of tests students must take each year. So as political actors in educators and social justice caucuses in alliance with parents, students, and communities are organizing to affect educational policy. Both caucuses have also been participating in the current protests and pushing for their respective cities to defund the police and for the school districts to end police contracts with public schools. So instead of seeking solutions for improving public education that's elaborated by privatizers or by mainstream policymakers, these activist educators and social justice caucuses fight for educational justice that's grounded in the power of the rank and file, broader bargaining demands that reach far beyond wages and benefits, and collective struggles for social justice. And there are political actors using their union to influence and change educational policy and improve public education. They also challenge education reform and reformers in public schools by challenging the national narrative from blaming teachers and students for failing schools to the realities of underpaid teachers, overcrowded and under-resourced classrooms, racism and inequality, and the deep, deep budget cuts that most school districts across this country are facing. They show that the work of teachers is not only as individuals in the classroom, but also as a collective in politics, in communities, and in the streets. And they also challenge their own business service style unions to broaden the union's demands beyond economic concerns and use its institutional and collective power not only to defend teachers, but also the students whom they teach in order to improve public education for all. So political power for these activists is an active union membership in a union that has authentic grassroots political power. And these educators use the Social Justice Caucus to build that power, push for progressive agendas in public education, and collaborate with school communities for social change. And social justice caucuses provide an important model of organizing against injustice and for education for liberation in these times of socio-political educational crises. Thank you very much.
Wow, that was right, beautifully timed. Thank you, and beautifully presented. So thank you very much, Chloe. And I apologize, there was background noise. I forgot to ask everyone to mute themselves, so I had to mute them, but there was a few seconds there. Awesome. So the next paper being presented is on encouraging productive disruption, developing civic capacity in urban high schools. The authors are Jacquelyn Greiff, Nora Reikosky, Sigal Ben-Porath, and Quinn, all from the University of Pennsylvania. And Nora will be presenting the paper on behalf of all four authors. She is a joint PhD student in education and political science at the University of Pennsylvania. And the paper will be available on the conference website, hopefully later today. So Nora, you're all set. Whenever you're ready, please start. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Julia. I really appreciate all of the work you've done in organizing the conference, which I know has taken on a rather new and novel form. And thank you, Chloe, for that presentation. I think that actually tees up really nicely into what I'm going to talk about. So to get started, again, this project is part of a larger project, and it was originally a project that was looking at comparisons between public traditional schools and no excuses charter schools. And that was the original seed for the project. It did find some differences, of course. However, that ended up not being the focus of the ultimate project and is not the focus of this paper, but I'll come back to it. And wanted to just shout some of the both contributors and other authors out for all of their incredible work on this project. So to get started, I wanted to go over the background quickly and especially contextualize this piece in the current political moment, which I think highlights the relevancy and the importance of building civic capacities in students and in schools. And I'm referring specifically to the Black Lives Matter movement and the revitalized attention that we're seeing in this context, but also towards civic empowerment for youth more broadly. And as many of you I'm sure have seen, the youth are coming out in a big way to support this movement. So this is an exciting time to be introducing this work. To get started, I also want to point out that we're particularly looking at the schooling context and schools, and are well aware and recognize that there are many ways that students learn civic capacities and develop those civic capacities from their family, from faith groups, other organizations. And we're considering exclusively schools and how schools contribute to the development of civic capacities for students. And particularly where they can impact efficacy, participation, and a sense of empowerment. So this is the schooling context in which we see an opportunity to equalize some of the opportunities to build civic efficacy, particularly in the current political climate where they can come into their political selves, these students. So to start with the backgrounds, the civic achievement and empowerment gap is undergirding this work, which tracks along the lines of the racial achievement gap and income gap that many of you are, I'm sure, familiar with. Likewise, there are existing civic education models, some of which require resources that are unequally or spread across schools or accessible to schools. So those are limited formal civic courses, knowledge around government and institutions, service learning courses that are existing outside of classroom time but still tied to class settings, extracurriculars like student government, debate club, and volunteering opportunities. And we see those three as all part of schooling, but requiring a set of resources, financial and often faculty, that may be outside of the accessibility for a number of the schools, particularly the schools that we looked at. The final one I'll mention is some research around open classroom climate, which is the most relevant to what I'm going to go on to talk about. We're thinking, many scholars have commented on this, but this is the opportunity to discuss in classroom settings politically controversial or otherwise controversial topics in the form of discourse where it is neither silenced, but it's also encouraged and brought into the curriculum as well as the overall climate of the school. So the last thing I'll just briefly touch on is disciplinary models. And so this is particularly relevant when we're talking about our no excuses school. And for those of you who aren't familiar, no excuses says that there's a large number of activities and behaviors and speech that is that may not be included in the student's behavior. So moving on, the research question that we focused on for this paper is specifically what opportunities, both those taken and missed, there are in a school context with limited constraints to develop the key civic skills of student voice and the capacity to organize among high school students where resources are limited and there aren't opportunities to necessarily beef up the extracurricular programs like debate, which requires often dedicated faculty, as well as a number of other resources. Our methodology for this particular paper and study was to spend time over a 2-year period that stretched around 28 months in 2 urban high schools in a large Northeast city, our traditional public school, which we refer to as Bridgemont, and one no excuses charter school that we call Smithfield. And throughout that 28-month period, we conducted observations both in classroom settings and in the broader school environment. So that's the lunchroom, basketball games, student parent night, et cetera, et cetera. We did over 20 open-ended semi-structured interviews with primarily students and a number of teachers as well, and then did 100 civic and political development surveys just to the juniors and seniors. Right. So the findings for this paper, I'm just going to briefly outline them and then I'll come back to them in a little while. But to just bring us all together here, the focus is on 2 areas in particular. It's on voice and organizing. And we see these 2 components as being practiced within the school context. And we saw them present in both of our school sites, though in various ways, and in some ways taken and in other ways missed. I'm going to provide more information about this, but the key part for our study here was that we saw intentionally promoting civic practices and capacities throughout the school day must be recognized in order to develop students as engaged citizens. And this doesn't necessarily mean that new resources or changes to the curriculum necessarily have to be brought into the school setting, but rather that a commitment on the part of the staff and perhaps the broader school community, parents, et cetera, are the key goal to achieving this work. So recognizing the multiple moments throughout the day, and we are thinking about these as small moments, of course there's larger ones, but the small moments throughout the day where this goal can be promoted, but also where it's impeded. So again, these are already available in the school setting without additional resources, but the schools that we observed varied somewhat dramatically into the extent into which they incorporated these opportunities into their school day, and more importantly, the degree to which they acknowledge their legitimacy in the way that a student was permitted or invited to participate in the school context. The concept that I'm introducing that is part of our paper here in the primary one is a concept of productive disruption. And of course, disruption is a buzzword in tech if you're familiar with some of that work, but productive disruption in this context are speech and actions that work to challenge or invert an ineffective, discriminatory, or problematic status quo. So this is a key finding for us that an important component of taking rather than avoiding opportunities around student voice and organizing has to do with the comfort of the school in accepting certain types of disruption as legitimate and even welcome components of students' actions and behavior rather than as grounds for a disciplinary action. So again, that's where I'll come back to the no excuses part. And this is the key concept that we are introducing in this paper, which can be seen in these small moments that are taken rather than avoided or rejected. And this is, in a sense, a willingness to recognize productive disruption as acceptable student behavior or action rather than action that demands a penalty. Productive disruption is seated in opposition in many ways to what we're terming unproductive disruption. And this is a type of disruption that detracts from or compromises the goals of challenging or inverting a problematic status quo. And this is, in a sense, to push back on a classroom disruption that serves no purpose outside of diverting any sort of productive work on the student's part. But we see this as seated next to neutral disruption. And the neutral disruption doesn't necessarily detract from the classroom's learning goals, but it doesn't necessarily challenge the problematic status quo either. So this is, as the text might allude, a bit of a gray space. And the way that we see this functioning is that we're calling for schools to accept and acknowledge productive disruption, but perhaps also permit neutral disruptions at a larger scale rather than silencing students. And this is part of building an open classroom and also open school culture that recognizes certain disruptions and begins to build civic capacities for students in these settings. Let's see. So back to my findings. The first finding I'm going to walk through is the opportunities to speak out. And these, again, are the student voices in the classroom and at the school. A disconnect that we saw was between a strict schooling environment, such as in the no excuses charter school, and the reality beyond the school setting. So this disconnect in which students are expected to be silenced and quiet and participate only in a very, very structured way was in contradiction to the reality of a civic space where action often involves inserting your voices, particularly with dedication and persistence into those spaces where they may be unwelcomed. So we saw these as often in opposition to one another. I'll just draw your attention to, this is a picture on the left from the charter school that we were in. And you can see in the middle, it might be a bit small on folks' screen, how to talk about race. And so there's particular sentence starters, sentence openers that students were using even in all contexts and all part of the curricular experience, and especially when discussing controversial issues. So just quickly highlight one of the vignettes that we have in our paper, which was a classroom we observed, Mrs. Thomas's classroom, excuse me. Mrs. Thomas was a very strong social studies teacher who, on the day of our observation, was teaching a civics course about miscegenation and miscegenation laws. And throughout the course of this topic, which students were highly engaged in, one of the students contradicted a piece of the presentation, pushed back on it rather, and instead of incorporating the students' engagement, which was on topic, on task, but did contest the statement being made by the teacher, Ms. Thomas, as you can see from the quote, suggested, we can talk about this later, and moved on. And so again, while we completely recognize the ongoings of the classroom, we thought this this was an identified missed opportunity that there was an opportunity to incorporate the student's interest and also recognize the legitimacy of the contestation. On the flip side, in the traditional school, Bridgemont, we saw teachers, or particularly one teacher, Mr. Gould, who regularly incorporated student interest into the course, often permitting neutral disruptions as well. And so while there were other challenges at that school that are worth mentioning, we saw this permissing and even acknowledgement of student disruption when it was, in some cases, highly relevant and was a pushback against the validity of the topic. In that course, it was about criminal law, which the students felt very strongly about. This was an opportunity taken. And additionally, we saw neutral disruption as an opportunity to move a bit towards productive disruption in the interim. And then finally, I'll just mention, not up on the screen, but a student, Clarice, who was receiving a disciplinary action at the No Excuses Charter School, who in multiple moments was attempting to push back against the disciplinary action. And the dean, who was reprimanding her, said, quote, "You're trying to advocate for yourself. Stop it. Just do what I tell you to." And we thought this really encapsulates part of what's happening in the school, the recognition of disruption as advocacy and self-advocacy, and the pushing back and silencing of the student. The second space is opportunities to organize spaces for civic action. And we saw almost the reverse here, where a level of structure, particularly in an extracurricular or classroom adjacent space, led to increased student opportunities and a perception of voice. Here we saw a number of taken and missed opportunities, and I've put up a couple quotes here and I'll read them quite briefly. The one on the left is the student from Smithfield, which again is our charter school. And prior to our observation period, the students attended at the request of the faculty a state capitol rally that was in order to maintain funding for charter schools. And so the students were invited to go to the rally, and as the student tells us, the rally made her feel like part of a team, because we all went down to the school district and we all protested together. And we were like chanting slogans and had signs. And I felt like that was a unity moment, the teachers, students, staff, and the principal. And so here we see a very positive interaction with protest and an opportunity that was taken by the school to incorporate the students into that moment. Following this moment, which was quite interesting, there was a removal of a dean from the school. He was fired for a reason that was not perfectly explained to the students. And the students spontaneously created their own protests. They protested the firing of the dean, and we saw in many ways a transfer of these skills that were learned at the state capitol rally into this type of civic action, which was quite exciting. In the upper right-hand corner, the Student Government Association Vice President candidate at Bridgemont, in the process of the pre-election speeches, in their speech told us, or told the entire student body, I should say, it doesn't matter who you vote for, because everyone up here is a great choice. All of us just want to make this school a better place. No matter how you vote, you can't go wrong. We all care. Unfortunately, the Student Government Association was disbanded at Bridgemont because they didn't have the resources after an administrator left to keep it alive, which again goes back to the ways in which structure is useful, but not always possible given the resources. And then lastly, Eric let us know through the student government, quote, we were able to ask for that from the admin, a small action, and to see that they changed it. So yeah, I would say my voice is heard. So again, the school providing avenues in which students can advocate for themselves, and again, particularly where there are opportunities to perform critical speech, which we again see and classify as a productive disruption. So finally, without drastic reform of the school structure, without funding changes or curriculum, which we acknowledge are constraints that exist within the school context, we do think that there are many opportunities that teachers and administrators can take both in the classroom and outside of the classroom to promote civic capacity and efficacy. A focus on voice and organizing and an awareness of the importance of productive disruption can help these practitioners orient themselves around the school, even within the current policy and funding constraints that they experience. These small moments, when the students are consistently disciplined or silenced, contribute to the development of a learned helplessness as civic actors. However, when students are permitted and even encouraged to disrupt an ineffective status quo, the students can learn to advocate for themselves and others, both as young citizens and future citizens, further developing their key capacities. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you so much. Wow, really interesting papers. Okay, our third and final paper for today is on the New Jersey's teacher workforce and teacher pipeline. The author is Mark Weber, and we were very fortunate because Mark had a power outage, so timing was really critical, and he was able to rejoin just before this all started, so we're thrilled to have him here. Mark has a PhD from the Rutgers Graduate School of Education. He is a special analyst for education at New Jersey Policy Perspectives, and a part-time lecturer at the Rutgers Graduate School of Education. Excuse me. Oh my goodness. Sorry, technical difficulties. Let me start that again. So Mark is a part-time lecturer at the Rutgers Graduate School of Education and a music teacher in the Warren Township Public Schools. So he is multitasking in a big way. This presentation reflects 2 research reports that will be available on the conference website. I apologize for the background noise. Mark, it's all yours.
Not a problem, thank you. Thanks to Julia for setting this up, and her staff and all the organizers. I love coming and doing this conference, and it was sad to think that we would have to cancel it, but with a little bit of good luck and thanks to Zoom, it's good to be here. What I'm presenting today isn't quite as academic as a lot of the other things in the conference or a lot of my other work. This is policy work, and it's born out of 2 reports about New Jersey's teachers, the first being about characteristics of the workforce, particularly teacher compensation, and the second about teacher candidates and the teacher pipeline. Oh, hello. Here we go. Just as a quick note, in my world, a lot of quantitative research is based around trying to get claims of exogeneity and coming up with sort of elaborate methodologies. And sometimes we leave out just basic descriptive statistics. And I think that's a mistake. Sometimes we just have to look at the numbers and see whether our assumptions are correct and whether we're asking the right questions. So what I've got here are primarily descriptive. Even the regression things I'm doing are descriptive, but I do think there's a real value in taking a look at these things. Just real quick, for those of you not from New Jersey, just to give a little background, we are an affluent state, we're well educated, we're relatively high performing on many measures. It's a highly educated state, and so there are a lot of opportunities for people with college degrees here. I don't think it's going too far out on a limb that we had a decade of teacher bashing. We had a governor who was not at all reluctant to speak his mind when it came to what he perceived to be the ineffectiveness of our teacher corps. Teaching pensions are a perennial concern in New Jersey. We'll talk about that a little bit. There are plenty of anecdotal reports of teacher shortages. When we introduced the second paper, Dean Nora Hyland from the graduate school at Rutgers was talking about how she hears from a lot of central offices about shortages in particular areas. And we do have a politically influential union. And I think those are all sort of important things to think about before we dive into the numbers. So let's get going first with the teacher workforce report. And we'll start by talking about demographics. We have seen a decline over the last couple of decades in the age of teachers. Not a huge one, but it is relatively steady. And it's led to an interesting kind of demographic bubble that has moved through the teaching corps. Let me see if I can illustrate this with a couple quick slides. We've got, this is from 1997, and you'll see that around then, teachers in their late 40s and early 50s were the dominant group in the corps. In 2002, the peak age for teachers was between 50 and 54 years. And if you step through every 5 years, you'll see what happens. I'll do it again. You start here and you see this bubble moving through, and then we're getting sort of a bimodal distribution. And so the last year that we have good data, in 2017, we've now moved where the peak age for teachers, or the peak bin for teachers is 35 to 39. So we've had this sort of demographic bubble move through. We have a younger group of teachers now. This is an interesting reality when we're talking about the pensions, especially because we just had a whole group of teachers who moved into the pensions, and we're kind of at a pause right now. Before COVID, this would have been an ideal time for us to shore up the pension system. Now we're going to have to see what's going to happen, but we should be aware that we do have this group that is looming and is 20 years or so away from moving to retirement age. Throughout both of these reports, I talk about district factor groups. This is something that we refer to a lot in New Jersey as a way of classifying school districts. District factor A and B are the least affluent. Some of them are the former Abbott schools. There was an infusion of funding for several years in the 2000s, and we actually see some ramifications of this. And then we move up to the most affluent districts. And so I've divided it into these 4 bins. We also have special service schools, charter schools, and VOTEX. So if we're looking at, say, the age of teaching staffs in New Jersey, the one thing obviously that stands out is the charter schools. Much, much younger average age for their teachers. And then consequently, that translates into the experience of these teaching staffs as well. But there is, with the other ones, not so much the VOTEX and special services, but with the other schools, there is this sort of gentle decline down. Looking at some of the other demographics, it's a profession that is overwhelmingly female, has stayed that way. It's a profession that's overwhelmingly white and has stayed that way. Very little change over the last 2 decades. If you look at the other races than white, very small. If you look at the scale on the left, you'll see it's not much of a scale. So we've had a very small increase in the number of Hispanic teachers, very small increase in the number of Asian teachers, and notably actual decrease in the number of Black teachers. So when you put that all together, what does it mean? Well, here's the breakdown. Again, the last year that we have good data, 2017. And the upshot of this is 2/3 of the teachers in New Jersey are white women. How does that compare to the student body? Well, only about 1/5 of the students are white females. So we got a real problem here with the alignment of the race and gender of the staff and race and gender of students. And I say problem because there's increasing evidence, there's good quality research that the alignment on race really matters for teachers and students. I don't think anybody would argue that you should only have Black teachers for Black students and white teachers for white students, but certainly it helps when children see that the teaching staff looks like they do. And we've got some work to do in New Jersey to try to get to a place where the staff looks like the student body. Teacher education, this interesting sort of collapse here where it's almost 50-50 between bachelor's and master's degree holders. We're seeing more and more teachers getting master's degrees and fewer in the core who only have a bachelor's. It's interesting when you look how it breaks down across the different kinds of schools. Again, we see that the charter schools, there are fewer teachers with those advanced degrees. But I think the most notable thing here is the most affluent schools, which is the line in purple, the GH and the I and the J districts. Those are the ones where either they are going out and recruiting teachers with advanced degrees, or teachers with advanced degrees are choosing to apply there, or there is some mechanism in which they are attracting more teachers with advanced degrees. Now, if you read a lot of the literature, they will tell you that advanced degrees do not matter for teacher effectiveness. I have a lot of problems with that literature. I think it's not well specified, and most of the research is on tested grades and not on a whole bunch of other types of teaching. But even then, doesn't it say something that the most affluent districts appear to value having an advanced degree? It's something we should be thinking about. Teacher pay, I think everybody looking forward to this part. It's no surprise when you just look at annualized salaries, teachers make less, and we know that. The argument is that teachers aren't working during the summer. There are differences in the hours that are worked and so on. And so the way that I've approached it, and a lot of other people have approached it, is through regression models. And the big thing in these models is to look at education. And the reason for that is that education returns to your wages probably more than any other factor. You're going to, no matter what your profession, you're going to make more money if you hold a degree. In these models, I'm looking at a whole bunch of factors: age, hours, education, weeks worked, labor market differences. I put some limits on the data. I'm only looking at wages, but it is worth noting that compared to other states, the teacher pensions here are pretty stingy. They've got long vesting periods. They've got small multipliers. And if you're going to compare benefits, you really have to compare them to similarly educated workers. So this is what I found in my modeling, that if you're a teacher with a master's degree, it's about a 17% pay penalty. It's about 14.5% if you only have a bachelor's degree, and that's with hours worked. There's a lot of reason to doubt whether we have good information on the hours worked by teachers, because of course teachers bring a lot of work home with them, and the question is whether it always gets reported in the data. So I ran the model both ways. For men and women, you get a real difference here. The pay penalty as a man is really quite substantial. Another way to look at this is to compare all of these groups to non-teacher men. And so if you have a bachelor's, you're a non-teacher man, you're going to have about an 18% penalty. If you're a non-teacher woman, you still have that pay penalty. But if you're a teacher and you're a woman, it all adds up, and you get this really large and substantial wage penalty. What I did is something that's been replicated before. And so Jeffrey Keefe, who of course is at Blaustein, has done similar sorts of things, slightly different data, slightly different way of looking at it, found similar scale that I did. Allegretto and Michel from EPI, they've done it, although their last time, the New Jersey model really shrank, and that to me was interesting. I'm not quite sure why. SFF is School Funding Fairness that Bruce Baker and I do, and so the things that I'm finding, a little bit on the high end, but pretty consistent in most of the models that we see. just to wrap up this section about the teaching salary across schools, of course, again, charter schools do tend to pay less. This is something Julia and I have done a lot of work on. But experience, you really have to look at salary and experience. And so if we just look at the regular districts, what you'll find here is there's a parallel between the Abbotts and the most affluent districts. There is a dip somewhere between like the 10th year and the 16th year, and that's largely has to do with the way that pay scales are set up in teacher contracts. But the non-Abbott A and Bs, and then the CDs, the DEs, and the FGs, they're really not paying as much, even when you look at experience. And the question we have to ask is, do they have the resources to be able to offer competitive wages? And Bruce Baker and I are doing some work on that right now about school funding, and should have some more for you pretty soon. When we add in the other schools, one thing I've noticed is that the special services districts really do not tend to pay well. And when I modeled this on salary data, if you look down at the special services districts, teacher number 2 is a teacher who's been teaching for 10 years, has a master's degree. There's a real pay penalty that those special services teachers face, and that is problematic because they're doing a very hard job. And again, we look at the most affluent districts, the GHs, the Is, and the Js, and they do pay a penalty for those teachers who are more experienced and have master's degrees. Just real quick, one last thing. The hours reported for teachers from 2009 to 2016, you'll see it's gone up while everybody else has gone down. And what's happened during that time, we've had new testing and new regulations and all sorts of other things, which leads me into the next thing. So I'll quickly get to teacher pipeline. If teaching is such a great gig, there should be a stable number of people who are entering the profession, right? If it stayed a great gig all of this time, it should be that way. We should be attracting more people into the profession. And is that the case? Well, this is based on federal data, Title II data. This is enrollment in teacher preparation programs in New Jersey, and we're down 63% since the peak in 2010. These are the number of people enrolled. The number of people who are completing has also gone down by a similar amount, nearly cut in half. What has happened during that time? Well, Chapter 78, which cut the pensions and the benefits for teachers, that was enacted in 2011. And then we had Teach NJ the next year, which made it much more difficult to get tenure, much more onerous restrictions on teacher observations and teacher ratings. And then a couple of years after that, we had Achieve NJ, which the first time that teachers were going to be evaluated on student test scores, an extremely dubious proposition. And then after that, we changed the tests over to the park. And at the same time, we fully funded in Chapter 78. So when you look at these two things together, is anybody surprised by this? Have we really done what we needed to do to attract people into the profession? This to me is interesting because we might be going through a similar thing. When the recession started in 2009, we had a sharp drop off in the number of new teachers because the districts weren't hiring. But what happened a couple of years later? All of a sudden there was a boom because they had to make up for either the waiting people had to retire, or they had to make up for the fact that they were understaffed. And so there was a boom and then it came back down. We should be anticipating this coming. I'm going to skip over these because we're running out of time. Just to say quickly, we're not alone. We're down, Pennsylvania's down, New York, Delaware, Connecticut, all across the nation. Men and women coming out, people of all races coming out, the number of people earning college degrees coming out. And I'll show this real quick, just as a very Jersey-centric sort of thing. I think it was Diane Ravitch who I first heard say that you've got to turn to the public colleges for who is going to be producing teachers. And you see Montclair State's been pretty close to even over the last decade. Kane has seen a huge drop in the number of people coming into their programs. Rutgers has seen an increase, but there's some volatility there. But also what's interesting here are the Catholic universities. And, Georgian Court, it's really fallen off big. College of St. Elizabeth has fallen off. And a lot of this, I think, has to do with a lot of young people looking at how much you pay for private college tuition and saying it's just not worth it. So just to wrap up, obviously we need to do something about benefits and compensation to attract the best possible people. We need to do everything we can to attract teachers of color. And the cheapest and easiest way to get good people into the profession is to start treating them with respect, showing appreciation, showing regard. If you look on the presentation, you can get all the links to the reports, and hit me up on Twitter, and check out the blog if you get a chance. I'd love to hear from you, and that'll do it. Thank you.